Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady. I'm the Online Media Manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Harmonizing Requirements in Business Architecture. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis from Enfocus Solutions, and the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So please make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to Enfocus Solutions for sponsoring the event. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Keith to get us started.
Good afternoon and welcome. And I appreciate everybody joining the discussion today. And we're going to do a little bit of heavy lifting around harmonizing business requirements and business architecture. We got a little echo in the line there, Ben. You got to mute. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different things here. We're going to talk about really what's the difference between these two, because there's a lot of confusion between what is business architecture, what is business analysis, how do these two things fit together. How do I then improve the value that I'm delivering to organizations as a result of this? Because they've got different disciplines coming together. And the theme really is getting down into, you know, everybody's got the same goal. We've got the same goal of improving project success. We've got the same goal of increasing the value of the business outcomes that we're delivering. But they're coming at it from different perspectives. And so when you start putting these pieces together, there's actually a lot of things that begin to change. So the discussion here is getting into not only how you change the value and how you go about delivering on some of these things, but also getting down into there's some really significant, you know, action plan items that you've got to start taking under to be able to make the pieces work together effectively. So this is an interactive conversation. I think we only have about 866 registrants coming into the session today, which is great. But we can make this as interactive as people want. So what I want to do is just have people use the Q&A area and mention one or two things that you might want to get out of the session today. And that way we get a little bit of practice using the Q&A area. Now, I know a bunch of you are going to be sitting in rooms with a whole lot of people around you. So, you know, welcome. Pick somebody as a designate who's closest to the computer and put one or two things in there. And I'm going to start talking about, you know, what we're going to get into talking about today, okay? So a couple of major themes is all about business architecture and business value. And people who know and have been on sessions with me in the past know that I tend to focus much more on the value layer. What are we doing and why? Where does it change? What's the value layer that we can begin delivering to organizations? And as a result of that, are we taking meaningful actions? Are we really changing what we're doing here? Because, you know, when you start looking at business architecture, a lot of these things are newer concepts. They've been around for a while, but from a discipline perspective, I suggest it's a little newer. This is a theme, by the way, that I tend to harp on, which is that requirements are valuable when they're connected and in context. And I use that a lot when I talk because, you know, I think when you sit back and you say, what's the value of a single requirement statement, something like the system shall display, you know, an estimated arrival date, something like that. When you use a statement like that, what's the real value of that? Does it have value in and of itself? Just use the Q&A area. Does that one statement, the system shall display an estimated arrival date, does that have value in and of itself? Wow, this is going to be, okay, Steve, thank you. No, it doesn't. It has to have context. You have to have something around it that says, what is this going to do? What is it going to change? How does it change and impact the organization? Okay? And so part of what we're also going to talk about, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today, is the action plan. What are the specific changes you need to make to begin harmonizing business architecture and business value? Because there's some techniques that you've got to shift. There's some process issues that you've got to address. There's just a lot of moving parts when you're dealing with this that you need to get into. So 2 slides on Enfocus Solutions, who we are and what we're all about. We're all about achieving business analysis outcomes, and we're a software organization. We have a SaaS solution in the business analysis space, and it comes together as a business analysis software together with a complete, robust professional development platform with a tremendous amount of content for analysts who are trying to uplift and change and bring a lot more value to the organization. And we combine that with a dynamic collaboration environment and measurement so that people can achieve results and showcase the results that they're bringing to the organization. So if you look at the pieces to the right, there's the repository, which is Requirements Pro, and that's all that functionality around managing requirements and doing the business analysis. But there's also layers like the coach and performance and onboarding and the support, the requirements excellence framework, which are all the materials for a complete, robust methodology and processes and things like that for doing business analysis. The part I'm going to talk about mostly today, or as part of this, is really some of the concepts around portfolio, which is how do you connect business architecture and business requirements together and make a meaningful, cohesive piece. Now, Requirements Excellence Framework is in behind. I just want to mention this. This is our own methodology that we're driving through that's compliant with BABOK and ITIL and all the different frameworks that are out there. So you have to have a cohesive way of going and driving requirements through the value within your organization. And that's part of what we do. So rather than trying to assemble this and piece it together yourself, we provide that as part of our overall solution. So with that, you have to have that word from your advertisers. Let's go through and talk about what is business architecture really, okay? And I just did an online Google search and give me a bunch of images of business architecture, and you see things like TOGAF pop up. You can see the one diagram in there and a whole lot of architecture pictures and things like that. And you look out and you start looking for different frameworks. You see the IBA, the old enterprise analysis structures that were in there, that kind of changing over the course of the different versions of the BABOK. But I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Business Architecture Guild, for example. They've got a BizBOK. BASIC, which is out of the OMG with their Business Architecture Specialist Group, Open Group. In fact, any of the architectural frameworks like TOGAF are going to have variants of business architecture built into them, right? So if you're looking at DODAF or FIF or, to some extent Zachin with the frameworks and the different, artifacts that they would be dictating, there's a lot of different pieces or different opinions on what business architecture is. And in fact, if you go online or you start thinking about what is business architecture, what are some of the things that pop into your mind when you think about business architecture? A lot of people, they tend to think of it as a blueprint, right? They start as, it's kind of abstract. It's this thing that exists that other people do. And that's not necessarily the case. You've got different levels of maturity in terms of business architecture. And I'm going to say that it's a younger discipline overall. You don't see it as broadly adopted across organizations. It's obviously business analysis. But you've also got patches where this is mandated. You have to do it. And certainly in certain government sectors, you have to do business architecture as part of what you're doing. So there are patches of maturity out there. But when you look at the definitions of what it is, you know what? There are maybe 20 different definitions. So I want to give you my own, right, to talk about what business architecture really is. And I think just trying to nail it down for people. Fundamentally, if I had one word for what business architecture is, business architecture is context. It's the best word that you could use to describe what it is for an organization. So I know, Christina, value chains and processes and pieces like that. Absolutely. It's got a lot of components to what it is. But we're using those components to really describe the context of what the organization does. And what it is in terms of being able to have a useful context, you have to have a couple of different components. You have to have an ontology, which is really making a decision about, well, what are the valuable pieces of context that we should be talking about, like customers or channels or products or etc., right? What are those buckets, the big buckets? And then underneath that, you have to have a common language for the way you describe things. So it is a taxonomy, right? It's a way of describing things when you're in the organization so that everybody's got the same words that you're using to describe what the organization does and how it functions. And then you've got this layer of, relationships, which is part of what the context is. And those relationships are very dynamic in that they describe. So even though your business architecture tends to be fairly static, the relationships that it's representing in an architecture, in business architecture diagram, those relationships, those pieces are very dynamic. They're talking about, organization, which is very dynamic, the information, the value streams, these other kinds of things, right? And they're very dynamic viewpoint. And you get views and viewpoints. And each view or viewpoint, there's a couple pieces to this. One is a business architecture is always an abstraction. It's a representation, right? But a representation is for whom and for what purpose. And that's what view and viewpoint is all about. So are we at a high level, with mid, low? What view are we at? And to whom are we providing that viewpoint? Because it's got to be useful, right? So it is a context that is useful to somebody, representing dynamic relationships, and so that we can all speak a common language. That's ultimately what business content architecture is. But it has certain things, okay? So business architecture has two layers. It is something, but it performs certain things for an organization, the reason for having it, right? It has a purpose, and that purpose is very specific in that you're always using this for communication reasons. Like you're creating it to create a discussion. And the concept is that you're creating a socialization or a prioritization or trying to improve your alignment overall with the business. That's your purpose, right? The reason for doing some of these things. It also has a scope, so you have to have a process that's behind it that supports that scope. So you're going to use it to, have certain governance of certain capabilities or certain reporting or whatever have you, and there's a process around which you do business architecture. There's a process around which you're going to conduct the activity of getting business architecture, right? And it has certain content. And the content in business architecture tends to be very different than the content, and I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit more, but the content of business architecture tends to be very different than that of business analysis or business requirements. And the content tends to be very capability and value stream and artifact focused, much like Christina has represented, value chains, process, etc. Okay? So there is an is, what is it, which is context. And if you just kind of stay focused on ultimately what it is this concept of context, then it's really a good anchor for people. Do you like this kind of picture? It's a good anchor for people to be able to explain it into the organization because the context actually is relatively static. It tends to not change over a long period of time. So, and architecture obviously has layers. So when you think about business capabilities being backed by business functions, being backed or underpinned by business process, right? Business processes. There's different layers to an architectural framework. But, when you look down through these layers over a period of time, they tend to be very stable. And I think that's one of the key messages is like when you think about all of the levels of change that go on with an organization, right? All of the levels of change that go on, it's almost like this great storm, right? And in the middle of these storms, you get these layers or pieces that are actually fairly stable. The organization's been doing them for 100 years. Unless, it's gone out and made major acquisitions or it's gotten rid of major components of the business, it is still needing to, process receivables or do federal reporting or whatever have you. So those business capabilities that it has tend to be very stable. And there tends to be, behind those fairly stable points, there tends to be organization that's needed. There tends to, as owners, there tend to be information that's moving. There tends to be a value stream that's in behind it that, also tend to create anchors for the organization. And as a result, your business architecture framework, if I can use that word, it's a series of models that create representations of viewpoints so that overall you're kind of moving toward a blueprint, okay? So the purpose for it really is that when you're dealing with projects, right, and you're dealing with that layer of business analysis that goes in behind projects are very, very dynamic. There's just a lot going on in a project. Each one has its own set of requirements. Each one has its own set of objectives. Each one tends to be in conflict with every other project that's going on. And you need to tie it back to a central point of stability so that you can begin rolling up and understanding, well, what is the whole and how is this impacting the whole, right? And those become central tenets for why you want to have business architecture behind. Also, I want to get across that these are actually contrasting concepts. They're very, very different, okay, from the perspective of beginning and executing, okay? So when you're in business architecture, you tend to talk about capabilities, right? What does the business do? And that's much more like a noun, okay? In business analysis, we tend to talk about requirements or requirements types and argue about requirements types. And, Babak has got these types and Hembach has got these types, and et cetera, right? Because it tends to be very much what are the needs of a very specific instance of a project rather than overall what does the organization do, which are capabilities. And what we're talking about actually tends to be very stable in the business architecture world, right? Versus if you take a 2-year view of requirements, I'm going to challenge you to say those requirements are probably pretty volatile over a 2, 3, 5-year period, right? You're going to get a lot more volatility in the requirements than you would. Business architecture is going to stay roughly the same unless you're doing a major divestiture or acquisition of a very different businesses, these types of things. And then you tend to be focused on planning when you're in the business architecture layer. It's the alignment of business and IT versus project execution. And the techniques that you're using, the structure of the way you do things inside business architecture tends to be value streams. What are the capabilities? Let's do gap analysis, these other kinds of things, organizational analysis versus the business analysis techniques, very traditionally, things like use cases, traceability, BPMN, context diagramming, these kinds of things. So the technique set tends to be different. And business architecture tends to work across project teams rather than business analysis. It just tends to be inside a project team. Does that give people a reasonable viewpoint? I know it's a little higher level. We're not going to get into the how of business architecture, but just to kind of give people the construct of it in terms of some of the pieces underlying it and where these pieces start coming together. Hey, thanks, Mark. Okay, so hopefully that gives some ideas in terms of where you can do. And from an illustrative perspective, it's important to be able to render to stakeholders what some of these differences are, right? Because it takes you into a good quality conversation about how BAs and business architects work together. Because what you want to do is talk to, as Keir is asking me to, talk to the influence of the two in terms of how you execute business analysis using some of the context of business architecture, okay? Because what you're really talking about doing is beginning to uplift. And let's talk about some of these structural relationships. Keir must have had my slides in advance because that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. Let's talk about the relationships, because the relationships are really what starts to uncover how these different functions begin to work together, right? Because it's not just a theoretical relationship. There's a physical relationship in terms of execution and a physical relationship in terms of if you're a business analyst and you're really looking to uplift and provide more value to the business and just drive a different relationship with your business stakeholders, you're going to adopt and do some of these things on the business architecture side. Versus if you're on the business architect side and you don't want to be in that kind of ivory tower, you've got to connect out to the project layer, and you've got to be driving value for people at that project layer so that those people are gaining that layer of guidance and benefiting from what it is you're doing, right? These two have to be working together, and it's all about this relationship that sits in the middle, okay? And so when you think about it from a business architecture perspective, it's when are you doing business architecture? When is a key point, because you could be doing it from a before perspective, and business architecture is creating structure for business analysis. Okay, in other words, and this is more of a classic view of what business architecture should be doing. In other words, you're using business architecture to define your capabilities, and based on identification of weak capabilities, you're going to say, where should we have an investment portfolio sitting behind? Because we have a weak capability, and we have no investment portfolio, and at the high priority capability, we've got a problem in the business, right? And so you would be thinking that business architecture is driving the portfolio, and therefore it is driving the structure for business analysis. In other words, what projects are we doing? They're always done in the context of some business architecture that's being done. Now the next layer is identifying interdependencies in. So what happens if you're doing business architecture during the project cycle? And this is the one that people tend to forget. And that what you need to be looking at is more the describing of how a project scope fits into the context of an organization as a whole, right? And that's the during, because you don't necessarily have to do it before. If you're focused on doing it during, you begin to knit together the pieces that you need in business architecture. But you could also be doing it after, right? Which is assessing the value of, right, business analysis. In other words, what is it that we did? If business analysis is successful, then the capabilities of the organization are changing at a much faster rate, right? The organization is changing successfully. It's adding capability successfully, which is ultimately what business analysis is all about, right? Business analysis is all about turning good ideas into action, right? Turn great business ideas into action. That's what business analysis is, the operationalization of good ideas. So if you think about it that way, if we're successful from a business analysis perspective, then we've physically changed or we've improved what's going on from a capabilities perspective within the business. It should be measurable, right? Is that a good picture for people in terms of the relationship? And so from a business architecture perspective, there's a contribution to business analysis, right? The flip side is we've got to ask this question. What is it that the business analyst needs to do if we're going to harmonize these two perspectives? And whether there's a business architecture function in your organization, or what you want to do as a business analyst is provide a greater level of quote-unquote service to the organization and your stakeholders, and you really want to uplift what your analysts are doing, then there's certain physical changes that you need to make to be able to harmonize these two layers. And it's actually quite a substantive list of things, just to kind of tip my hand and talk to that, okay? Quite a substantial list of things. Because what you need to do is start thinking about, first and foremost, well, why is business architecture so critical? What am I trying to do? But also, how do I begin to shift some of these pieces within the organization? How do I begin to shift how I do some of these things on the way through, okay? So let's go through, and Dawn, I'm going to end up having to answer your question afterwards, after the session, but I absolutely will make sure I answer your question. It's a little long for me to try to pick it up right now, but I'll come back to you over the course of this session, okay? Now, let's talk about why business architecture is so critical, all right? When we think about why it's so critical, we're talking about different layers within the organization in terms of, what's the scale? Like if I'm on a single project, my context is going to be along the lines of, I want to be more proactive, right? My context is going to be along the lines of, I don't want to be an order taker. I want to drive business value much more proactively for an organization. I want to improve project outcomes. So for example, on project outcome, if I'm just doing requirements, I've been handed a project, and my only task is to take what is a defined set of things and just define the requirements, I don't really have a vestiture in the outcome. Somebody else has defined all of the objectives, all of what it is I need to accomplish, all of what creates or instantiates business value to the organization. So if you want to be part of that, it has to be thinking about, okay, well, how do I change that? But also, business architecture really helps in terms of how you identify interdepartmental requirements, because those interdepartmental requirements tend to be much more architecturally related, all right? Now, if we're going into dozens or hundreds or thousands, you're not just dealing with one puzzle piece, you're dealing with many. So every single one of these projects has an impact. Every single one of these projects could change the context of the organization, right? And so as a result, you get into this multiplicity. You get into exponential interdependency growth. I want you to think about that, what that really means. Let's say every project. Would it be unreasonable to say that even an epic is going to have maybe 4 or 5 interdependencies of some kind, right? 4 or 5 interdependencies of some kind. Is that reasonable? Now let's say, okay, thanks, George, I appreciate that. Yes, in fact, that is the case. Maybe a few less. Okay, okay. So if that's the case, and you think that each one are going to have, some number of interdependencies, then what ends up happening is you get this exponential growth. Let's think about it as 10. Well, now you got 50. Well, let's think about it as 100. Well, now you've got 500, interdependencies. It's an exponential growth curve, right, of these things that could be impacting your business. And therefore, the aggregate, so even if you're only dealing with a user story, which is quite simple in and of itself, right? A user is going to do, an actor is going to do something under some conditions with, So that type of thing, it tends to be very simplistic, but when you have an aggregate, you get high degrees of complexity across the organization. So you can no longer keep track because you have no idea the context of one individual piece of this thing and how it's impacting other things. And the description of scope, therefore, becomes useless. And I'm going to just throw that out there because it is heresy, right, to say that the scope is useless. But I want you to think about why the scope is useless. If I'm dealing with, hundreds of projects and I'm the CIO, how is it that I can become familiar with each one? I can't. I just can't digest that information. I can't roll it up. I can't take 100 descriptions of scope and read them all simultaneously and become intimately understanding it. Because scope ultimately is, what is it we're trying to accomplish, plus all of the, the underlying underpinnings of what it is with the organization, right? So no matter what you have as your scope description, even if it's perfect from you sitting in the project, you understand every aspect of it, it's always going to be frustratingly vague to your reader because you can't roll it up. But you can roll up the impacts to business architecture and therefore understand the scope a lot better. And when you're coordinating a large number of stakeholders, you've got all these interdependencies on them, and then trying to be able to deal with cross-divisional interdependency. Have you ever been in a situation where you've implemented a project which was brilliantly and perfectly implemented, And the reality is that after it was implemented, there were so many interdependencies that got overlooked that you wish that you'd never, ever seen that project before. Yeah, exactly. Mark, thank you. In fact, it happens all the time, right? Where you can have a brilliantly, trying to speak in English, brilliantly constructed project, well executed, but the interdependencies to the business created so many problems that you're better off not doing it, right? Because it just fundamentally shifted some things. It shifted costs from one area to another, et cetera. That just undermined the organization as a whole. And that becomes real problematic, right? So let's talk about harmonizing these two, right? When you start talking about business architecture and business analysis, and I hope I'm getting across, these are two very different breeds of mammal here, you know, and I hope people like my picture. But essentially, you know, it'll work when cows fly is kind of my underlying theme, you know. So you got to think about what's different, right? Are we really dealing with the same thing? Are we dealing with different things? If we are dealing with different things, then we have to be very clear about, well, what needs to change to enable these two things to work together? And there's actually quite a long list, and I'm just going to walk through some of the major changes. So these are the major ones that I want to talk about in this, because what I want to create for you is an action plan. What I want to create for you is, if you want to go forward and start implementing some of these concepts into the organization, there are some very specific things that you can try. Thank you, Fran. I'm glad you love the picture. Unfortunately, some of the questions are coming into the middle of my panel here, so it's a little harder for me to pick them off as I go, but I'm going to try to make sure I get them as I go, okay? So some of the major changes that we get into talking about are going to be things like, well, your process of doing requirements has got to change, okay? Now, not for everybody, but for many of you, it's going to shift, okay, in terms of the way you do requirements. And there's just a couple of stage steps that you've got to start dealing with as a result of this. How you identify stakeholders change. I don't know how many of you out there have missed stakeholders when you're doing projects, but as a result, it creates all kinds of problems with the project, right, if you miss them up front. So how you identify stakeholders shifts if as you put this in. The next one is going to be where you put certain requirements information. Okay, so many people generate fairly voluminous, I'll just use that word, requirements documents. Well, where you put certain information, much of the information in requirements documents is actually business architecture information. It belongs in a different process. So you have to think about, where am I going to put and harvest things, right? And so now that's shifting, okay, well, how about how we communicate scope? Because the way you communicate scope is going to shift dramatically. And then the last piece is basically how you're detailing requirements, or how you approach it. So those are, does that sound like a pretty significant list of stuff, right? Pretty significant list of stuff that you're going to need to get into if you're starting to talk about harmonizing these two layers. And hopefully, people don't see this as insurmountable, okay? Let me give you an action plan. Okay, let me give you an action plan that starts to get into, how do you go about doing this? What are the specific changes you need to think about making as you go forward and do this, okay? Some of them are going to be actually very simple. The very, very small changes that begin to bring these pieces together and allow you to either uplift the business analysts so that they're performing more of a business architecture proactive role within the organization, or to shift to make sure that these two pieces, if you get different functions, a portfolio management type function or a portfolio analyst type function together with your business analyst function, that those two are working together in a much cleaner way, okay? So here's a typical snapshot of a requirements process. And it's really, you know, you start with eliciting needs, you develop your requirements, you document your requirements, standard, okay? Now, a lot of times people are using that old standby business, process decomposition structure where you're starting to say, okay, let's start with, what initiates this process. Let's start with the process. What is the process? What's the typical outcome? Well, how do you know, et cetera? Give me some overview of what the things are, and then start getting down into the context of the variation of the system, okay? So you start breaking it down from a process perspective when you get into the development of the requirements. Establish your scope, break it down, use processes as the holder that you're going to use to drive the requirements process. I don't know, a lot of people are very similar to that? Yes. Yes. Okay, thank you. I got about 10 people who said yes all at the same time. So the issue when you're in a harmonized world, you start with what is being impacted. When you start with yes, you got to elicit the need. You got to understand, well, what is the need in terms of capability or what we're changing? But it's all about impact. What is it that we're impacting? And there's different ways that you can go establish impact, but you might start as simply as you might have a visual, like a capability map that you just kind of circle. Okay, I'm going to impact this, okay? And it might be that you're just capturing, the nature of the impact. What's the issue? What's the outcome? What's the severity? Simple stuff like that. Or if you don't have a capability map, here's an acronym for you, PC Tadpole. Do you like that one? PC Tadpole. It's basically, as an analyst, when you're just in the initiation, it's not that you're going to share this with your stakeholders, but when you're sitting down and you've got an understanding of what this project is, think about it from the perspective of, okay, what is this impacting? Is it impacting product? What product? Customers? What customers? Technology? What technology? Application? What applications? Data? What data? What processes? What organization? What location? These things. So ask yourself, PC Tadpole, what is this thing impacting? And again, is it a significant issue? What's the outcome that we're trying to do? What's the nature of the change? And what's the severity of the change? Is it significant? Or, finally, you could be using tooling like Requirement Pros, ours, right? Which you could be just capturing those impacts and capturing, just saying, okay, click, this is one that's impacting, and begin notifying from there. But the idea here is that you initiate with an impact. Okay, what is it that this thing is hitting? Because that's the layer in which you're capturing that information in the organization. The second thing that you're doing is you're starting to understand the impact drives something. Okay, the impact drives who are the owners, who are the subject expert, what are the constraints of an impact, which is a critical issue, right? I mean, when you're sitting down and you're looking at understanding dependencies in a project, how often is it very, very difficult to sit in front of a sheet of paper and say, these are dependencies, these are the constraints? Because the constraints are driven by those impact owners. Those are the people who can tell you what the constraints are. As we're working together, what are some of the constraints for your organization or for your system or for your this that we need to understand as we're going forward and dealing with this? It also identifies for you those interdependent initiatives, because you have no idea how many other initiatives are going on that are hitting the same business. How many other initiatives are going on that are hitting the same system in many cases, right? And so you need to sit back and look at that. But also the way that you do the impact analysis can also be driving your entire enterprise in terms of the way you do the elicitation. So think about it from this perspective. You've got a certain number of impacts. It could be that it's a process impact or a data impact or a service impact or a stakeholder impact, etc. All of these are impacts. Well, let's start with the biggies. Let's start with, okay, maybe this is a stakeholder impact. Like the biggest thing is here that we're trying to change the way that we're trying to change stakeholder behavior. We're not really trying to change the process per se. We're trying to change the stakeholder behavior. Well, does it make sense to start with a process analysis? No, not really. Not really. Because what will end up happening, right? What will end up happening on the way through is you get too much focus on the underlying process without getting to the why. Okay, so think of it this way: each of these individual boxes, process, data, service, stakeholder, business objective, conceptualization, each of those can and does have an elicitation methodology behind it. Okay, so you've all heard of process decomposition, right? Which is your process impact-centric way of eliciting requirements. But there's also data-centric ways of going and eliciting requirements. You could start with state diagrams, events analysis, these are the kinds of things. Service impact, go read ITIL. There's a ton of information in there about how to use service impacts and understand service impacts and drive requirements from it. Think about stakeholder impact. There's a wonderful set of elicitation methodologies around the way you can elicit requirements just based on what is the behavior that we need, right? So we're starting with who, right? Who is being impacted? What is the behavior that you need as a result, or what's the change in the behavior that we need? Why is that change so valuable to the organization? And then how do we enable that change, which really is the feature itself that you're trying to implement into the organization. So by doing it this way, not only you're capturing what the impact is, but you may be simplifying radically the way that you go about eliciting requirements and gathering requirements and more directly connecting those requirements to elements of business value for the organization. Is that kind of a cool picture? People like it? Reasonable? It's opening the doors to different ways of doing the job of business analysis. Because what you want to do is you want to radically reduce the amount of time it takes to go get to complete accurate requirements, right? You don't want to spend time doing process impact-centric stuff if that's not really, at root, the major or the majority of the impact, right? It could just be that you're trying to do one incremental state change. Well, let's start there. Well, what is that change? How do we, and then drive the process from there, okay? So the second thing is that the process models really should not be in requirements documents. And I know, again, this is a little bit of heresy, okay? But do people kind of buy into that? How many people here use use cases? Just say, yes, I use use cases in the QA area. Yes, you use it. Fran, thank you. Christina, thank you. Beckel, yes, you use. Now, all of you people are saying yes, okay? Trina, Olga, etc. Bruce, thank you very much. Gary. So all of you people that use use cases, do you tend to have those use cases in your requirements documents? Most of you? Yes? Just say in the requirements document. Yeah. Okay. So now, let me ask you a brutally tough question. How usable are they? How reusable are they? So they're very usable in that you need them to describe what the change is. But from a reuse perspective, it's brutal, right? You can't separate it from the requirements document. And the reality is that, yeah, Christina, only initially are they usable because you can't separate it. But the reality is because that's an enterprise architecture artifact. Okay? What happens is it's a legacy of a text-based, big document-based approach to doing requirements, that the use cases themselves really should not be in the requirements doc. They should be linked to it, right? But they shouldn't necessarily be in there because the use cases themselves are highly reusable. How the process is constructed is very, very reusable, right? Versus the, like I'm talking about business use case now, the business use cases themselves are very, very reusable, but they tend to get stuck in these documents which are not reusable, right? And you can't go find them. So that's what I mean by, you can think about, like, how many people here do data dictionaries in your requirements documents? Do you do data dictionaries? This is exact, some, Christina, thank you, Sherry, you do. So that data dictionary, when it's in your requirement doc, it's not usable, not reusable. It's very usable, it's not reusable. And again, this comes back to older world when so many people are stuck with templates. And those templates keep business architecture information in a place where you can't get at it, rather than you get a link to it or something like that. And it's really separating out, in business analysis, are we managing the document or are we managing the data? Are we managing the way we're going to go and deliver this and creating as much reuse just structurally, the way we go do the requirements structurally, okay? Exactly, that's what requirements repositories are for, Aaron, okay? So when you think about how you change the communication of scope, okay? When you communicate scope and you're trying to harmonize business architecture, okay? You need to think about that you're communicating the scope and how that scope impacts, right, or integrates into the business context. So take a look to the side. I'm not sure if you can read it all that well, but it's basically the feature is field observation capture, okay, on the right. And this is it's a snapshot of Requirements Pro, but hey, I'm a software vendor, you got to forgive me that one, right? But when you think about this scope, field observation capture sounds pretty simple, but it's impacting those two features. It's impacting a couple of different business stakeholders significantly. It's impacting certain related services components. Certain data's got to change. Two major processes have to change. How big is that feature? Exactly. Gary, thank you. Brian, thank you. Yes, this is a big feature, right? This thing is much bigger than people say because all those pieces have to be managed, right? So until you can track and say this is the impact, until you're actually picking that up and rolling it up in some way, you don't really understand scope, right? The scope is just a set of words to say this is what the project's about, these are the features of the project. But until you really connect it to something that's much more stable, right, it's hard to really understand how big is this thing. And that's where people tend to blow it, right? That's why projects tend to get loose. And so you need to basically also use to find the functionality that sits in between. So a lot of times people are using context diagrams. So you basically have, here's my system they're trying to deal with, this is the context around it. And they're using that to help figure out what gets lost. But the context diagrams themselves, the context diagram is not a discussion. What you need to do is create a discussion, right? The impact is the discussion. And so the idea here is that you're creating the discussion with a stakeholder around how their behavior is changing. Creating a discussion around the process owner. How's that process changing? And that's what requirements is all about. And then you need to also, how you choose to organize and analyze really determines what dependencies you see. Like, how many people have, use a Word document template to do requirements? A lot of people on the call here? Jerry, yeah, yep, you, Steve, thank you for Olga, yep, okay. Excel, Betty, come on, you got to get out of the dark ages here. Okay, unfortunately. How difficult is it? I got to bet that you guys have this issue where you've got one thing in there, and it's a blank, and it says dependencies, and you got to list all the dependencies. I mean, how brutal is that, right? It's brutal. It's got to be the toughest thing in the world to figure out, right? Because you got to list all your dependencies. I remember 15 years ago doing one for one of the big hydros, and it had this thing. I don't know. Like, what are the dependencies? I don't know. Well, each one of these impacts basically begins to identify for you your dependencies. You're going to go out there, and you're going to talk to them and say, what are the individual elements of this thing? What are the constraints? What's being hit? And that determines for you the dependencies. It makes it much, much, much faster to begin identifying and dealing with that. Okay? Does that make sense? People like it? Okay. I'm going to move a little faster. Believe it or not, I can, in fact, talk faster. Okay? So when we're talking about the process control, and we're talking about what is it about requirements what's changing here, you've got to be able to deal with ideation to feature, feature to requirements, requirements to value. Those are three different layers, right? Three different layers within the organization that are happening. And the business viewpoint and the developer viewpoint and the transition viewpoint are three very, very different things, okay? And I'm not sure if my slides have changed for you because I see the go-to meeting thing here is flashing up some messages at me. But let's just continue on, and the show goes on regardless of what's going on with respect to go-to-meeting, okay? So the different layers in this thing are getting down into separating out the business viewpoint from the developer from the transition viewpoint, okay? And so part of this is where people tend to make errors or where people have trouble is that the way they do requirements drives people so far into the weeds that it's difficult to roll up and maintain a consistent business viewpoint, which allows people to truly understand the solution scope, understand what the problems, the needs are, the gaps, what are we trying to do or impact by this, and that piece becomes disconnected. They tend to focus too much into the requirements. What are the featured requirement pieces? And that's really a developer viewpoint, right? And so you need to understand that. You need to be able to do it, but you need to do it in the context of how is this impacting the business, but also how are you delivering this? How are you taking this from requirements to value? So business analysts, right, and I hate to, because I'm part of the profession, right, I hate to harp on this, but we tend to focus on that middle layer, right? Would you agree with me on that? We tend to focus on that middle layer. But it's really, uplifting analysts is taking us into the upper, right, into the ideation of the feature, and into the requirements to value layer. How do we then make sure that we're building solutions that truly deliver on the business value that we're trying to, that's being articulated, okay? So the next one, and again, just use the Q&A thing to let me know that you can still hear me, okay? So are analysts forced to use techniques that don't support reducing risk? If you don't mind, use the channel there, or Ben, let me know that people can hear me, okay? So are analysts forced to use techniques that don't support? And my contention is that analysts almost invariably are forced to use techniques that don't support reducing risk. And I know it's a weird thing to say, but if we were delivering perfectly, okay, what you would see is a clustering along the line that how susceptible a project is to requirements risk and how frequently do projects fail to meet certain kinds of objectives. We would sit right along that line. But in fact, that's not the case, right? There are certain project types that tend to be very, very risky for analysts, all right? And the types that focus in on re-engineering or reducing cost or communicating with employees or stakeholders or suppliers, these kinds of things, reducing transaction or indirect costs, all these types of areas, what you've got is a situation where the processes themselves are very unstable, right? You've got a lot of interdependencies, you've got an unstable set of processes, and as a result, the projects tend to blow up. And I'm not sure How many of you today have projects that look like those in the upper quadrants? How many of you have projects that look like those in the upper quadrants? A lot of you, I can see that. So as a result, you put yourself at extreme risk, right? As a result, what ends up happening is that people are unable to see. What's happening. Okay. Next, let's talk about harmonizing architecture and business analysis. Now let's talk about architecture, and hopefully you don't mind my cow here. It's basically because we're talking about actual architecture. I thought I would put a little bit of a propeller head on this particular cow, but that's just to kind of keep things going. So harmonizing architecture and business analysis, what's different from this particular perspective, okay? So what's different from this particular perspective is that you're into connected requirements, okay? You're into, hang on. When we're into connected requirements, what we're trying to do is basically begin to, and this is a TOGAF picture. What we're trying to do is from a TOGAF perspective, what ends up happening is this upper layer in the business, right, gets disconnected from the next layer down overall, right? And the next layer down is really the enterprise architecture layer within the organization. And those two pieces tend to get disconnected, okay? So this is one that you guys need to be able to see, and people are probably wondering, what is this guy talking about? But I'm going to move a little faster, okay? So when you look at certain types of projects, they should be sitting right on that line, okay? How frequently does the company meet these objectives versus how susceptible is it to requirements risk? It should be sitting right on that line. And the issue is that certain project types are actually very high risk because you're dealing with process reengineering or direct cost change or transaction indirect cost change. These kinds of things tend to throw it off, right? Because you don't have the stability of being able to do simple process decomposition, et cetera, right? So the business architecture allows you to start looking at these interdependencies, which tend to throw those projects off, and you tend to lose scope and control. So let's talk about harmonizing architecture, okay? Enterprise architecture and business analysis. What's different? You like my cow picture? Can I people like this one? Okay? Because obviously this is a little bit of more of a propeller head issue going along the line here, so you guys can use that. Yes, Jerry, you can download my slides, okay? You can pick that up afterwards. That way you can see the full deck of what it was I was talking about while we were in the quiet zone there. So connected requirements are all about, and this is from TOGAF, connected requirements is really all about linking together that project layer and the architecture. So this is something that is much more aligned in terms of how an enterprise architect begins to look at an organization or bringing together capabilities across the organization, okay? And what happens is that the enterprise architecture layer, that bottom piece, which is actor, role, function, process, those pieces tend to get disconnected from the project layer, principle, constraint, assumption, et cetera, which is delivering a capability. And so when you're looking at, what business architecture is all about and what linking the two is all about is, at the bottom you have this architecture repository. At the top you have to have that requirements repository, which is much more project-focused, transactional, stakeholder-oriented versus planning-focused. Because the bottom one tends to be much more of a modeling tool, right? And so these two things are different. And the harmonizing is really this concept of connected requirements, which is you're trying to maintain the synchronization between the plan and action. Again, take a look at the layers in actor, role, function, process. Those are all things that you can declare, hey, there's an impact here in this project. And as a result of declaring those impacts, people become very excited. The architects are now in a better position to align what's going on from a planning perspective to what's going on from an execution perspective across the organization. It is the way to implement architecture inside an organization, because that really becomes a challenge, right? How do I implement this architecture? Well, I implement it through a series of projects. The only way to ensure that I am properly implementing is to understand at a project layer perspective what is changing and am I impacting in the right way across the organization, okay? And obviously, architects have the opposite view to what's going on from an analyst perspective. Architect wants to start from the process or either a system or process summary and say, what are my processes, and then be able to look at, well, what are the specific features, what are the specific projects that begin to impact that thing, and then can I go across my organization and understand those impacts and begin exploring impacts across my organization. So hopefully, even though we had a few audio problems, and this particular one looks like it was just my internet failing in the middle of the discussion here, which wouldn't be the first time. But anyway, hopefully we got in a good discussion around business architecture and business value. What creates business value when we're dealing with business architecture and starting to harmonize business requirements with business architecture? I think my major theme in this discussion is requirements are truly valuable when they are connected and in context, okay? Those two things need to go together, all right? If they are not together, then there's a problem. And really, the context is the business architecture, right? Remember how I linked those two words so strongly at the beginning? Business architecture is all about context. So what happens is that when you are having this concept of business architecture, and you use that as the anchor of context, it just creates a tremendous benefit across the organization. And then hopefully people got a good view of the action plan, okay, or at least what you're able to see of it, which is the specific changes in how you do requirements, right? There are a series of very specific changes in how you do requirements. And I think I listed about 6 of them that you have to go into in terms of changing the process, changing the way you identify stakeholders, changing the way you go forward and begin doing your elicitation. All those things can shift and positively shift to remove waste out of the business analysis process. But also there are some specific techniques that you can use, and hopefully that helps you identify who are the other stakeholders and getting into, how do you also take these concepts and start talking to the enterprise architect people in the organization, say, we're going to shift requirements in this way. This is how it's going to positively benefit you, and begin to help you see that across the organization. Now, you always have to finish with an ad. Hey, we're the secrets of successful projects. We've got software, professional development platform, dynamic collaboration environment, and a great way for you to execute on what it is that we're talking about here during the discussion, and that's certainly the portfolio layer. And if people are interested in seeing it, certainly reach out and give me a call, and we can have a conversation and walk you through the discussion here. So if you're interested in the slides, and a number of people have asked me for the slides throughout the discussion, email to Andrea Palton. It's apalton@InfocusSolutions.com. In the upper right-hand corner of the slide that you're looking at here is her email address. Just copy that down, and we can send you the slides. Thank you, Fran. Yes, it will take a little while to digest this because there's just a huge amount of information coming at people, including flying cows with little Google propeller head things sitting on them. But hopefully you'll like the discussion. Let me see if I can answer some of these questions that I missed while I was I guess offline here. So which one is business analysis? Which one is business architecture? So when you're talking about business analyst versus business architect, a lot of times in organizations, Kevin, you've got a specific role called business architect, or you have a portfolio management role, or you've got a senior business analyst role where those, or you've got a customer-facing role where people are looking over our portfolio. They tend to be more business architecture focused, those types of people. Business analysts in organizations can also assume the role, right? So those are things that, any of these things can be done by analysts. You know how we're always talking about how do you uplift the function, how do you uplift the profession of business analysts? Well, by doing some of the things that we're talking about here, right, which make the whole requirements process so much more forward-looking, so much more proactive in terms of the way you do things. What is the relationship between business architecture and enterprise architecture? So business architecture is a subset of, or you could call it a subset of, enterprise architecture. Now, I would tend to say that they are different disciplines, okay? That you need to understand business architecture to do enterprise architecture, but they are interdependent disciplines. Now, if I'm in the TOGAF world, or I'm, DODAF or these other ones, they would look at it more as business architecture as a subset of enterprise architecture, okay? So there's differences in terms of the way, the cow is wetting the dolphin. Well, clearly the dolphin is Kevin is asking, is the cow the analyst, or is the dolphin the analyst? And clearly the dolphin is much more streamlined. It's got to be the analyst. The cow has got to be the enterprise architect, okay? So do you have a template which you could share that's used to elicit requirements? Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of different pieces. Are you talking about mainly in terms of how you can use those different techniques for eliciting requirements. I actually did a webinar with Modern Analyst a while back that goes into great detail. If you send Andrea a link and say, can I get that webinar, we can send it over to you. And it's got in it a lot of the different techniques in terms of really exploring, well, how do you do stakeholder impact analysis to drive out features? How do you do, but if you're interested in a template itself in terms of capturing the requirements, obviously I have to recommend that you use Enfocus Solutions and Requirements Pro, right? That's just, I got to say that. And the other questions that are coming in, let me see if I can pick up some of the other ones that we have in the background here, because I know I've got about 2 minutes left. But we've got another question which is really talking about capabilities. Capabilities are the what the business does, and what the business. So analysts tend to think in terms of process, right? And that's more the verb, whereas what the business does is more a noun. It's a much more stable thing that always exists within an organization. And there's just a difference between a capability, which is what a business analyst. But if you're interested in this kind of thing, there is the BizBox. We're getting a lot of box out there these days, but the Business Architecture Guild has a BizBox, which you could use and look up some more information in terms of what the specific techniques of business architecture and some of these things. We've got another question in here which is really talking about the relationships of impact mapping, and it's a little longer question, but let me just paraphrase. When do you do it? So impact mapping you tend to do iteratively and incrementally, like you would with requirements development. And so what you would do is at the beginning of a project, when you don't really understand scope, you're using impact mapping to identify and say, okay, based on what I've seen so far on the scope of this project, I believe that it impacts these processes. I believe it impacts these stakeholders or personas. I believe it impacts these. And you're just basically uncovering or discovering, you're saying, what is the nature of the impact? And then what's the outcome? Okay? So what am I trying to achieve by changing process? What am I trying to achieve by changing and working with my stakeholders? What am I trying to achieve in terms of a data perspective? And those pieces, right, those pieces allow you to begin saying, okay, what's the criticality? And based on the criticality, where do I begin, right? So what am I trying to do from an overall project perspective? And then what you're looking for over the course of the project is A, identifying additional impacts, but also you begin elaborating the impact, much in the same way that you elaborate requirements, you elaborate your impact. Because that's where you have to gain agreement with people, is on what exactly am I going to do to your business, or what am I exactly going to do to your service out there, and how does it change? Gary, you're asking me a tough question. Should analysts be TOGAF certified? I think there's always benefit to, as a professional, having the broadest base of knowledge possible. I think from a TOGAF certification perspective, that really tends to be a little bit more the domain of an architect, design perspective, also, or an enterprise architecture perspective, rather than maybe coming from the business side. But it really depends on what you want to accomplish in your career, really, to be able to answer that question. But it's a good question, so I appreciate it. If you have additional ones, send me your questions through Andrea. But again, thank you all for your attendance, and I wish you all great success. Cheers.
Thank you, Keith, for a very informative presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar, and also thank you for putting up with our little folly here with technology, but these things happen. And I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event, so we hope you have a great day.